بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهديه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمد عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ربي زدني علما ربي زدني علما ربي زدني علما. Previously in the lessons of fiqh, we discussed matters pertaining to ghusl. So we spoke about the fara'id ghusl, we spoke about the sunnah actions of wudu, and we spoke about when ghusl is necessary, we spoke about when ghusl is wajib, and we spoke about when ghusl is sunnah mu'akkada, and we then spoke about when ghusl is nafal. And finally, in the topic of ghusl, we spoke about those scenarios where one does not need to do ghusl. So as a very quick recap, there are 3 fara'id in ghusl. So that is to gargle the mouth, to rinse the nose, and to wash wherever is possible without undue difficulty or hardship of the entire body. So this means obviously washing, the inner bit of the belly button, washing the bit of the ear which is apparent, and etc. Washing one's private parts, the outer skin of the private parts, etc. This is all counted amongst the fara'id. So if a person misses or leaves dry to the extent of a single hair on a person's body, then their ghusl will be incomplete. There are 5 sunnah actions of wudu, and they are to make intentions to recite Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and this should be recited before entering the bathroom and before taking one's clothes off. So to recite Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, this is a sunnah action. Thereafter, to wash the hands until the wrists, that is a sunnah action. Thereafter, to wash one's private parts, both the front and the rear. And the next sunnah action is to wash off any filth from the body. And finally, to perform wudu first, followed by pouring water over the entire body, starting with the head for a total of 3 times. These are the 5 sunnah actions. In regards to when is ghusl fard, ghusl becomes fard on a person when because of the emission of sperm, many that leaves its normal place inside the body with pleasure. The second scenario when ghusl becomes fard on a person is when during one's relationship with one's wife, with one's spouse, so the disappearance of the male private part into the female private part. The third scenario where ghusl becomes fard is the ending of menstruation or postnatal bleeding. As for when ghusl is wajib on a person who becomes Muslim, and before becoming Muslim, that person was in a state of major ritual impurity, meaning this person had to have, if he was a Muslim, he would have had to have a ghusl. Ghusl was fard on him. So someone who becomes Muslim while in a state of major ritual impurity, ghusl is wajib on that person, although the sound opinion is that the ghusl is fard. When is ghusl sunnah mu'akkada? So ghusl is sunnah mu'akkada for the Friday prayer. So Jumu'ah Salah, before attending the Jumu'ah, it is sunnah mu'akkada, emphasized to do a ghusl. Also, to do ghusl on the 2 Eid prayers. So before attending the 2 Eid prayers, it is sunnah mu'akkada to have a ghusl. It is also sunnah mu'akkada to have a ghusl before entering into the state of ihram. And finally, after the midday on the day of Arafah, it is sunnah to have a ghusl for those performing Hajj. As for when ghusl is nafal for entering Mecca, for entering Medina, and also visiting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When is ghusl not necessary? So ghusl is not necessary when the exit of madhi or wadi occurs. And madhi is that fluid which is in English it's called pre-seminal fluid. So this is a fluid which comes out due to excitement or anticipation of having a relationship with one's spouse. So this is the exit of madhi. Wadi is that fluid which comes out either before urination or after urination. So if any of these 2 fluids come out, then one does not need to do ghusl. However, if any of these comes out, then one's wudu will break, and a person will obviously have to renew their wudu. And that goes for anything that leaves the private parts. So anything that leaves the private parts, we have learnt in the previous lessons that it will break one's wudu, and a person will have to redo their wudu. The second scenario when ghusl is not necessary is waking up after having a wet dream yet finding no wetness. So a person sees something, but yet when the person wakes up, they find no wetness in their trousers. The third scenario when ghusl is not necessary is the insertion of a finger or the like into the female private part. So this is where ghusl is not necessary. And finally, if one is to have, or if one has relationship with any sort of relationship with an animal without the emission of sperm, so this is where ghusl is not necessary. And obviously we spoke about how that Islam is a complete way of life, and the fact that we have these laws does not mean that Islam condones this. Obviously Islam completely forbids any sort of pleasure or sexual gratification except through husband and wife, and this is the only means that is allowed for a person to fulfill their desires. Everything else is explicitly haram, and having these laws etc. just shows the breadth of Islam, in the sense that it encompasses all forms of people etc. in terms of their character. So having this law does not mean that Islam condones it. Rather, Islam obviously forbids it, but this is the law for those people who do engage in these actions. Inshallah, in today's session we're going to be having a look at tayammum. So tayammum is known as dry ablution. So when does a person do tayammum? What is tayammum? So tayammum is a procedure done to purify oneself from ritual impurity. So ritual impurity meaning being not in the state of wudu, being in need of doing ghusl. So this is what we call ritual impurity, meaning it's not physical impurity. You won't see when a person needs to do wudu, you won't see like there's a mark on his body or something indicating that he needs to do wudu. So this is a ritual impurity, meaning it's not really a physical impurity, it's a ritual impurity. So when a person needs to do wudu or ghusl, so it can count as a substitute for wudu and ghusl. So tayammum, if a person needs to do wudu, and for some reason or the other he doesn't have access to water, or he can't do wudu, so then a person can do tayammum in exchange for that wudu, as a substitute for that wudu. And also, let's say a person has had a wet dream and they are now in need of doing ghusl, but for some reason or the other there is no water available, or maybe the person's ill etc., then a person can do tayammum as a substitute for that ghusl. So tayammum counts as a substitute for both wudu and for ghusl. So when is tayammum allowed? When can a person do tayammum? Or when can a person resort to doing tayammum? Because a person would always go to do wudu first, and if one of the reasons, or if one of the scenarios are found, then and only then can a person resort to doing tayammum. So tayammum is the second option. A person cannot choose to do tayammum whilst having the ability to do wudu. So if a person does that, then the action, the tayammum will not be accepted. So when is tayammum allowed? So number one, being 1.16 miles away from water. So let's say a person is on a journey and he has no water with him, and the nearest town, let's say, etc., is 1.16 miles away. So in this case, a person can do tayammum. The second situation in which a person can do tayammum is through extreme cold. So let's say a person is out camping, for example, in the countryside, and it's a very cold night, and if a person does tayammum, then he fears that he will fall ill, or he fears that due to the extreme cold his limb will become damaged, or he might become diseased, etc. So due to extreme cold, a person can resort to doing tayammum. The third scenario is due to sickness. So let's say a person either can't lift his limbs up, or he fears that if he does wudu or ghusl, then his sickness will only increase. So then in this scenario, tayammum is allowed. The fourth scenario is wounds on most of the body. So again, like we've been mentioning, is if a person has loads of wounds on his body, specifically the areas where he washes during wudu, if he fears that if he goes to do wudu, then the wounds will become infected, they'd bleed more, etc., then and only then in this case can a person do tayammum. The next scenario is fear of thirst. So let's say a person is again traveling and he only has sufficient water on him, which is just for drinking. He doesn't have any other water for drinking. So let's say a person is walking because obviously back in the day this is what they used to do, walking from Mecca to Medina, and the water that the person had with them is just enough for them to drink, is not enough for them to do wudu. So due to fear of thirst, a person can resort to doing tayammum. Another scenario where tayammum is allowed is the fear of an enemy or a wild beast around the water. So let's say there is water available. So especially back home, let's say there is a well, and the well is in your back garden, but there is, let's say, a snake or something like that, a snake or a wild dog that's around the well, and because of the fear of this wild beast, or another example is the fear of an enemy as well. So let's say the well is in the grounds where there's mines around, planted around, or there's some enemy encamped nearby. So a person can resort to do tayammum in this scenario. And the final scenario where tayammum is allowed is due to the fear of missing the funeral prayer or Eid. So this is in the Hanafi madhab. So if a person, let's say a person is running late, and he's running late for the funeral prayer, and he thinks to himself that if he goes to do wudu, then he'll miss the entirety of the funeral prayer. So in this case, a person can quickly do tayammum and join the funeral prayer. Same thing for Eid. If a person is running late for Eid prayer and he fears that if he goes to do wudu, then he will miss the entirety of the Eid prayer, then and only then can a person resort to doing tayammum. And this is because there is no qada for funeral prayer, nor is there any substitute for Eid prayer. This is why there is leniency here for a person to do tayammum in this case. So these are the scenarios where tayammum is allowed, and inshallah in the next few sessions we are going to be looking at how does one perform tayammum, what are the fard actions in tayammum, etc. And we'll also be looking at what breaks one's tayammum. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all the ability to act upon what's been said, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all the ability to perform all of our actions, all of our a'mal in accordance to the way shown to us by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Subhanallah bihamdi, subhanakallah bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.